Chaos Chambers were perhaps the most disastrous endgame conceived out of the Borderlands franchise, potentially even being more universally hated than the Peak. But why is that, and what can potentially be learned from their failures to make something amazing in the future? How's it going, my short kings? It's your boy Papa Perk, and today we're going to be looking into that exact question. Going over what went so disastrously wrong, what went right, and what we can pull from other sources to perhaps make the greatest piece of endgame content in Borderlands history. Hyperbole? Probably. But it's a YouTube video, baby. What more did you expect? Now, before we get into things here, let's quickly define a roguelike, as it is a term that I'm going to be using a lot in this video. Roguelike describes a permadeath dungeon crawl that has randomized or procedural elements in which you start from nothing. Upon death, your run ends and you lose all progression. A similar term is roguelite, which is a game that has the same gameplay loop, however it also contains meta progression, aka progression that happens outside of or during a run which will carry over to future runs. There are some things I'm going to talk about in this video that do fall under the category of roguelite, but to keep things easier to follow and because meta progression isn't a super important topic for this video, I'm only going to be using the term roguelike for simplicity's sake. But with that out of the way, for those unaware, Chaos Chambers were the endgame progression in the 2022 Borderlands spin-off game Tiny Tina's Wonderlands. They were a series of randomly selected rooms from a large pool of dungeon rooms, where at the end of each room there was a choice between two potential portals, allowing you to choose either taking on a curse, blessing, or being rewarded with more loot in the form of either weapons or gems at the end of your next room. Each of these rooms also had an objective, which if completed would reward more gems. These chambers also contain mini-bosses every few rooms and a final boss at the end. Once completed, you were taken to a room to spend all of the gems that you collected during the chamber on the loot bunnies, which would spew out a bunch of weapons or gear of their specified type. This was the general layout, but there were also multiple types of chambers. The regular one, which is just as I previously described. Extended, which is your average chamber, but just longer. A weekly rotating chamber, which was always just a set path of rooms and bosses with increased drop chances for the bosses to drop their specific loot. A boss rush mode, which was added later on, being exactly what it sounds like, a chamber containing only boss rooms. And finally, and most agonizingly, the Chaos Trials, which served as the endgame progression. At the end of one of these chambers, you would be rewarded with the ability to up your Chaos level, serving as the higher difficulties and endgame progression of the game. Initially, you would only gain one at a time with a max of 20, however, through updates that max would increase to 100, with many of those levels being gained multiple at a time. This all created a pretty unique take on the endgame of Borderlands, offering a pseudo-roguelike experience. And while it was a pretty cool idea in concept, there was some problems in the execution, so let's talk about We're going to start out here with the biggest issue first, as a lot of the other problems stem from it. Gearbox doubled, then tripled, and quadrupled down on Chaos Chambers. These things weren't just a part of the endgame, they were the entirety of the endgame. You want to farm for gear and weapons? Well, dedicated farming sources suck, and tons of weapons are world drop only. Farm the Chaos Chambers. You want to progress through the endgame challenge tiers? Better head on over to the Chaos Chambers. You want to take on raid bosses? Find them through puzzles located in the Chaos Chambers. You're gonna have to complete a chamber every single time you want to fight them. Oh, new DLC is coming out. I wonder what it's gonna be. Chaos Chambers. It's more Chaos Chambers. But you know, there was also that weekly content. As long as every week you wanted another Chaos Chamber. Every single activity you could possibly wish to do in the endgame of Wonderlands was just delegated to being Chaos Chambers. If you wanted to do almost anything, you would find it in the chambers. This led to what would initially be a fun and unique take on the endgame, quickly becoming stale. This made Wonderlands as a whole probably the easiest Borderlands game to burn out on, but as I said, this is just the biggest failure of them. Chambers also didn't offer enough variety, especially with how prevalent they were meant to be. There was a decent amount of rooms, but not enough for how rapidly you'd move between them, and with how small each room was, it was very easy to quickly get used to all of them. I think the chambers would have been better off with less overall rooms, but making them significantly larger, just to allow for some form of exploration. As it is currently, within maybe 10 to 15 runs, you'll have seen at least a majority of the rooms and will have learned their layouts because most of the time you can see the entire room from where you spawn in. This variety problem only gets worse once you had your build finalized. Early levels of Chaos are a bit more entertaining because the balance allows you to use goofier shit, play around with more builds, and fuck around with the gear that you get upon completion. But later on, as the tiers get more challenging, you are pushed to have an almost perfected build to continue on. And once that happens, the joy of the bunnies turns to fucking dread as you sit at that same rabbit at the end of each run hoping to get a goddamn snake stick with fucking echo on. Another problem related to the room size is that there's way too many loading screens. This is maybe a bit of a nitpick, but it definitely is something that I found impacted my enjoyment of them, because having the portals at the end of each of these tiny little rooms ruins any sort of feeling of fluidity that most roguelikes often have. The lack of this flow ends up with the chambers feeling almost cramped. You're just crammed into a tiny room only to be stuffed into another immediately after. Playing through a chamber just ends up feeling kind of claustrophobic, jagged, and each room just becomes super disconnected from one another. The whole thing at no point feels like a single entity. Enemy density within Chaos Chambers was also a huge point of contention for quite some time, with many players feeling that there weren't enough enemies spawned at a time within each room. This caused many scenarios where you're just wandering around trying to find a couple enemies here and there. Since launch, enemy density has gotten much higher and is in a better spot through patches, but I think the root of this issue wasn't actually the density, and because it was never actually properly addressed, it does still cause problems to this day. Enemy density feeling poor is partially a symptom of the way enemy waves spawn within each room. A few clusters of enemies will spawn randomly across the entire room, leading to the feeling of enemies being very few and far between, especially in those larger rooms or those with more walled-in sections. Compare this to BL3's wave-based slaughters, where instead of randomly spawning them around the entire area, one of the spawn sections will light up at the start of each wave and enemies will spawn specifically from that set of locations. This gives you the freedom to move around the map how you want to, rather than trying to hunt down enemies to move on, as you'll always know where the enemies are actually going to be coming from. And finally here, there's way too fucking many chaos levels. This isn't exactly a problem with the chambers themselves, and more so just a problem with the overall endgame progression, but having to take on 100 chambers just for progression makes it even more painful to then have to do them to get gear, fight raid bosses, or to just have fun in the endgame. This is even more of a problem for those of us that played since launch, as initially there were no level skips as you progressed. So I myself had to actually play 100 chaos chambers to get to chaos level 100. And that's excluding any that I did just to farm gear. If you want to hear me rant more about this, I have a dedicated video for that, which I will link in the description. I think nowadays though, you still have to complete around 60 to 70 chambers to get to chaos 100. But really the root of this issue is just that the endgame of Borderlands was incredibly grindy, but just having the endgame along with everything else tied to these chambers was just a massive fucking mistake. But with all that negative does of course come some positive. Chaos chambers weren't all bad, so let's go over. Once again, we're going to start off with the biggest point here, the concept of chaos chambers as a whole. If you look at them in a vacuum away from them being the only content in Wonderlands, they're fucking awesome. The first few chamber runs are incredibly fun because they are a roguelike experience. You progress through a random selection of rooms, you gather gems, fight a bunch of enemies, select between choices that augment your run, and complete it all with a massive amount of loot at the end. The issues only become apparent due to the execution not being varied enough run to run and how many times you're expected to run them. But again, this concept of having a roguelike experience in Borderlands is fucking incredible. The boss rush mode, which was added later on, is an amazing use of the current iteration of Chaos Chambers. It's exactly what it sounds like, a Chaos Chamber where you just go from room to room and fight randomly selected bosses in each of them. For anyone who's played Kirby games, it feels incredibly similar to the arena modes present in a lot of them. The entire system as a whole just felt like it was better suited to that boss rush mode than anything else. I don't think this should be the future of the mode, but I do think some sort of boss rush should return if Chambers as a whole are to in the future. Simply a fantastic mode, fun as fuck, and showcases that variety can simply just come from having additional modes. And finally here, the objectives are great. At least most of them are. Fuck you, Sacred Ground. But the point is that having actual goals in each room is really nice. It also opens up that opportunity for more reward, which is always welcome. These types of objectives are honestly more so what I expected when we initially learned that BL3's Proving Grounds were going to have objectives rather than the time goals and single enemy that spawns in a random room that we ended up with. I think that this is where the focus on bringing in that variety should be, where instead of just making a bunch of tiny rooms where half of them look the same, create a bunch of possible objectives. Some quick and easy, some being the entire focus of a section, whatever. An actual active part of the experience is what should be the focus of creating that variety, not just the fucking set dressing. But Wonderlands isn't the only thing that I want to talk about in this video, so moving away from that, there's another almost roguelike experience available to us in the Borderlands series, that being Although Arms Race released first, to me, it was overall a better experience and did a better job capturing that roguelike gameplay loop. While its intention is to be more of a PvE battle royale, due to that PvE nature and starting from nothing, it ended up feeling like it filled my want for a roguelike-esque Borderlands experience far more than the Chambers did. Though this isn't to say it truly was a roguelike really at all. You didn't have any variation between characters, with skills and action skills not being present. There was no way to really create a build during a run without just getting really lucky with items, and there wasn't much variation between runs themselves outside of where you dropped the Murder Cane's movement and the weapons you'd get, although I did prefer this variance over what was provided in the Chambers. But the boss was always the same, the location was always the same, and the enemy types were always the same. There's a lot of elements missing here to really call it a roguelike, which makes sense because that wasn't what it set out to be. Arms Race is really its own thing, but I do believe it's a showcase of why this idea can work. Specifically, Arms Race encapsulates one of my favorite loops in the Borderlands series in a way that can be done over and over in the endgame. That being starting from nothing and working your way up through those weapon tiers. A large majority of my saves across all the games I've leveled up to max manually. I fucking love this part of the game. Loading into a new save, starting from nothing, being weak as fuck. There's nothing like that feeling of a fresh character, and that's exactly what Arms Race delivers with each and every run. You aren't the supremely overpowered superhero that you are anywhere else in the game. You're sent right back to square one and have to figure it out from there. The early game gameplay of Borderlands in most games is completely lost by the time you get to the end, but Arms Race allows you to experience it whenever you want. But unfortunately, there's still a lot missing. You'll get stronger as you play each run through various gear, but you still don't have the progression of leveling up, speccing your skills, and just playing around with builds. There's no real powering up through the duration of a run, you're just getting better weapons. Hey, you guys ever hear of Roboquest? Roboquest is a 2023 fast-paced FPS roguelike with classes, levels, skills, and a whole fuck ton of guns with a cartoonish comic booky style. Sound familiar? And listen, if you're a Borderlands fan and made it this far into this video, I'm just gonna quickly give a very large recommendation to this game. It's incredibly fun, and while it is its own thing and does a great job at being its own thing, it's hard to say it's not at least a little similar, and for the purposes of this video, showcases what a Borderlands roguelike could potentially be. Specifically though, what I want to touch on here is how it handles progression. And really, it's quite simple. As you carry on your way killing enemies and such, you'll gain XP. When you hit a certain amount of XP, obviously you level up, which grants you extra health and the ability to pick a power-up. These come in the form of either perks or upgrades, with perks being more game-changing abilities that define your build for that run, and upgrades being smaller, well, upgrades. Often being just an increase to a specific stat or making one of your selected perks more powerful. While I don't think this system being ripped one for one is a good idea, having a level-up focused progression system fits perfectly. The level design in this game though is also incredible, with each map being a long section with offshoots here and there that can provide more loot and more enemies. Between each of these larger sections is a rest spot in which you can get some free loot, heal, and interact with some of the friendly robots that can show up here. These bots can level up your gear, reroll affixes, or offer you other weapons or skills in exchange for the materials you've gathered during your run. This game just offers so much in the way of build crafting. There's still RNG elements to it, but during most runs you will have guns and perks that are interacting with each other to do some crazy shit, which just makes starting a new run feel all the better as the game perfectly wraps up that early game to end game loop of Borderlands games into a beautiful roguelike package. And now with all the context to my thoughts finally out of the way, I could ramp up this video with a nice little conclusion, but that sounds boring as shit. Instead, we're gonna conclude in style with my suggestion for the revamp of Chaos Chambers, the newest, hottest, and presumably most explosive murder game show on Pandora, hosted by the lovely Mr. Torg himself, the Chambers of Carnage. I'm going to break this down into sections, first talking about the layout, rooms, and related mechanics. Each major section follows the same theme, being divided into 3 rooms with a mini-boss at the end, which is when the next section will be generated. Each section is about the length of one of BL3's trials, aiming for an average of around 5 minutes, minutes and follows a similar layout where you're fighting through an area rather than just moving around a single room. You are moving point A to point B rather than running in circles until all the enemies are dead. Each section will also be generated upon entry, picking those 3 rooms from a pool. As I mentioned before, I believe in quality over quantity, and also that variety can be carried more by other systems such as objectives, so while these rooms would presumably be bigger, there wouldn't need to be a huge amount of potential rooms. Along with that though, all these rooms, due to their linear layout, could also have the ability to be reversed to add just a little more variance. There's a lot of potential in theming for these sections as well, which can also provide varied gameplay. A stronghold type area with low ceilings, tight corridors, and close to mid-range type enemies, like bandits and psychos, would make CQB weapons ideal. An Eden 6 swamp with large open spaces, dense brush with jabbers, saurians, and snipers would let long-range encounters be king. A Promethean cityscape able to incorporate a mix of ranges between its rooms, fighting through streets or incorporating verticality and having you climb through a building to reach the exit. You'd be wanting more mid-range weaponry to take on both those shorter and longer range encounters. These are just a few examples, but you see how the themes could not only provide variance visually, but could actually change how you want to tackle each section. These are some pretty varied areas though, and thematic consistency was a problem that I somewhat had with the chambers. So how do you solve this? Well, tie it all together with a thematic through line. All of these rooms and sections, while having different themes, are all designed as if they were built on a rudimentary, almost brutalist set, having thick concrete walls on either side, maybe some holes blown into them with rebar showing through. Even in natural settings, while maybe being harder to see through the brush, having that concrete be seen through moss growing on those walls, or if you go too far out of bounds, so to speak. Not only is this just a neat thematic that ties in with the game show setting, but it creates that consistency. Moving between completely separate biomes wouldn't feel as awkward if it was clearly a man-made production. Now for objectives, I think each section should have side objectives, maybe things similar to the trials or slaughters. Complete in X amount of time, kill a certain amount of enemies with X method, maybe find a hidden vault symbol or something. Simple stuff that you can do while moving through your section. But I think each room should also have a more complicated objective that is required to actually move forward. Some of these could be more simple, like just kill all enemies, but I think it would be awesome if these objectives were more involved, maybe some even being multi-parted. Say you're in a Pandoran scrapyard, you've got to fight through and find the controls for a wrecking ball to bust through a wall of cars before you can progress, maybe even having a named enemy to take care of to get the keys. Or you're in Promethea, the door is right in front of you, except you're on a mission to retake this part of the city before you can leave. You have to climb a nearby building to hit a button at the top to unlock a capture point. Now you can jump off like a fucking badass, take on enemies while you capture the point, and continue on through. Not only can more involved objectives just be fun, but it's better incorporating another part of that early game Borderlands loop, completing quests. Enemy spawns will also follow a similar method to trials, being spawned at the locations where you are as you push through rather than being just randomly spawned and having to be searched out. Some rooms may also still have those wave-like spawns, however these rooms would be built with exactly that in mind, being smaller to avoid any downtime in the action, and also following a similar spawning strategy to those slaughters. This would also be a type of objective room itself, surviving those waves before you can move on. Having the option for named enemies to sometimes spawn within these rooms as rare spawns could also be awesome, not only just for the potential for more loot, but also because Mr. Torg screaming, "What's this? A new challenger is approaching? Get fucking ready," would get me fucking hyped. Next up, let's talk progression. At the start of each run, you have nothing but a generic pistol and the ability to choose an action skill. You begin at Carnage level 1, which sets you to be the equivalent of a level 1 character no matter the level you enter at. Side note here, I do think there should be a separate leveling system just to avoid confusion, but also because each level is going to be coming far quicker. You'll gain XP from a few different sources, completing room and side objectives, killing enemies, and also from looting chests to encourage exploration, allowing you to decide whether you want to complete a room quickly or trade off time for potentially more loot and XP. As you level up, you'll be able to earn skill points, which of course can be spent on skills. Though there is a bit of a problem here. I want to allow for as much fun and potential build crafting as possible, but I don't want the player to be leveling up constantly to be level 72 by the end of like 10 to 15 minutes. There's two solutions here, and I'm not too sure which I prefer. Either you gain multiple skill points per level up, somewhere around maybe 3 to 4, but I feel like this encourages a lot of time to be spent in menus, although is far simpler. What could also be done and would potentially make balance easier is to reduce the max level of all skills. 5-point skills would go to 3, 3-point skills would go to 1, and 1-point skills would stay 1. With this, only 3 points would be needed to be spent per tier to move down, meaning you could reach a capstone by level 16. Honestly, this still sounds like it might be a bit high, but I don't know. I'm probably thinking too hard about this at this point. Either way though, the goal would be to at least be able to reach a capstone by the time you reach the boss at the end of the second section. While you can gain skills this way, action skill augments cannot cannot be equipped through your trees. We'll come back to this. As you level up, gear and enemies will of course also scale with you. Enemies get stronger, weapons and gear get stronger, and loot quality will also increase, dropping higher tiers more often the further you go. I would want this to be gradual though, with purples only dropping commonly at much higher levels. And speaking of which, while I want the minimum of a run to get you enough levels for a capstone and only be 2 sections, at the end of each boss you can either quit the run early to claim rewards or carry on for another 2 sections. Though of course, the more you do this, the harder things are going to get. After these bosses is where we'll have a bit of a rest area, allowing you to spend iridium obtained during the run. This iridium can be used either to buy gear, weapons, or ammo from a set of vending machines, or to upgrade some of your currently equipped gear to match your level if it's fallen behind. Though iridium isn't the only thing you'll find in your run, as you'll also be getting Torg tokens, given to you for completing rooms and side objectives, killing enemies, and at the end of the run, you'll be given a set amount for each level you had when you left. These will be the currency to be spent outside of the run to get your rewards. With bosses, I honestly don't have too much to say other than that they don't really need to be anything too fancy most of the time, as the purpose of a boss in a roguelike is just a build check. With that being said though, of course having multiple is ideal and maybe at least 2 per section theme. However, I also love the idea of bosses potentially being able to roll modifiers on them just to provide a further challenge, having each consecutive boss rolling more and more modifiers. I know the word modifier can be scary for a lot of us, but I'm not talking about them in the sense of mayhem modifiers. Just adding some sort of stat change or resistances would be fucking boring. I'd rather these be the type of modifiers to actually change the fight and how you have to tackle it. New abilities, maybe an added armor or shield bar, the boss now dual wields, they start weaker but have 2 additional phases, things like that. Modifiers that are actually engaging and will change the boss's run to run. But now what about loot? Loot is what you'd expect for a Borderlands game. Enemies can drop gear when they die, there will be randomly placed chests in rooms that can be looted, and any sort of named enemy, mini-boss, or boss will drop far higher quality loot than most other enemies. But as I mentioned before, augments can't be equipped from your trees. Instead, you'll be able to find them in special caches, providing a random one of your character's augments for your currently equipped action skill. The reason I split these off into being separate from trees is that I really enjoy the idea of there not being an augment limit. If you find enough caches, you could have all your augments active at once. This just simply sounds like a damn good time and something I wanted to throw in here. Within the rest area after each boss encounter, there will be a red chest, offering you the choice between either getting some gear for the run, some iridium, or some Torg tokens. Within these rooms will also be a loot extractor, which for a price of a few Torg tokens, will send a piece of gear found during your run to your bank. And finally, for a few smaller details with this, I really like the idea of having a drone following you around like in the Waddle Gobbler DLC for Borderlands 2, just to kind of add a little bit more to that murder game show vibe. It'd also be awesome to hear some fanfare whenever you do cool shit. Applause, cheering, maybe some fireworks or confetti for surviving a room. And of course, with this thematic, you'd need to have Torg commentating, introducing objectives, interrupting with ad reads, berating you when you die, all the usual fun Torg stuff. But that's it. That's the Chambers of Carnage, my pipe dream of Borderlands content that is definitely far more of an entirely separate game than side content. I may have gotten a little carried away. But what are your thoughts? Do you agree with my assessment of the Chambers? Do you have other ideas on how you may want to see the idea return? Of course, let me know with a comment below. But that's about to do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, definitely consider leaving a like and maybe a subscribe. Down in the description will be a link to my Twitch channel where you can follow to be notified of when I go live. And just under that is a link to my Discord server where you can come and join and hang out. But with that all being said, I hope to see you guys in the next one.